In the oldest, darkest corners of Eastern European folklore, there exists a rigid, unbreakable law governing the undead. A vampire, no matter how ancient or powerful, cannot simply break into your home. They are paralyzed at the doorway, blocked by an invisible barrier, unable to cross the threshold until the inhabitant explicitly invites them inside. This mythic rule was never just a spooky campfire tale. It was an ancient psychological warning. The most destructive predators do not arrive with a battering ram or a declaration of war, but with a charming smile and a polite knock, waiting for you to willingly unlock the door to your own ruin. This ancient metaphor perfectly encapsulates the initial, terrifyingly beautiful phase of an encounter with a narcissistic personality. They stand at the psychological threshold of your life, scanning the architecture of your emotional boundaries. They understand that to extract your energy, your resources, and your identity, they must first bypass your natural defenses. They cannot force you to love them, nor can they force you to surrender your autonomy on the very first day. Instead, they must trick you into dropping the drawbridge yourself. The battering ram they use to breach your defenses is a psychological phenomenon clinically known as love bombing. This is the seduction phase, a period characterized by an overwhelming, suffocating tsunami of affection, attention, and grand gestures. To the untrained eye and the unsuspecting heart, it looks exactly like the fairy tale you were promised since childhood. It feels like destiny, a cosmic collision of two souls finally finding their missing half in a cold, chaotic universe. During this golden period, the narcissist operates less like a lover and more like an intelligence operative in hostile territory. They are actively gathering data on your vulnerabilities, your past traumas, and your deepest, unmet needs. Every late-night conversation where you bare your soul is not a mutual exchange of intimacy, but an interrogation disguised as empathy. They listen intently to your stories of past betrayals, not to comfort you, but to learn exactly what your previous partners did wrong so they can temporarily play the role of your ultimate savior. They are mapping the psychological threshold, looking for the exact phrase or gesture that will make you swing the door wide open. To understand the mechanics of this covert infiltration, we must turn to the clinical framework established by Dr. Craig Malkin in his seminal book, Rethinking Narcissism. Dr. Malkin dissects the idealization phase of cluster B personality disorders, revealing that this intense early worship is not actually about the victim at all. The narcissist is chronically empty, devoid of a stable sense of self-worth, and they rely on external validation to survive. By idealizing you, by putting you on an impossibly high pedestal, they are actually elevating themselves. They believe that only a perfect, flawless being could be worthy of their attention, and therefore, by associating with you, they become flawless by proxy. Dr. Malkin's research highlights a terrifying reality. Narcissists do not choose their targets at random. They meticulously study and seek out highly empathetic individuals, people who possess deep wells of compassion, forgiveness, and an innate desire to heal others. Empathy is the very currency the narcissist lacks, and they are drawn to it like a moth to a flame. They recognize that a highly empathetic person will project their own good intentions onto the predator, assuming that the narcissist's intense focus is rooted in genuine love rather than calculated consumption. The victim's own capacity for deep connection becomes the very weapon used against them. According to Dr. Malkin's clinical perspective, the narcissist views the empathy of their target not as a virtue, but as a highly exploitable resource. In the world of cluster B disorders, vulnerability is synonymous with weakness, and compassion is merely a lever to be pulled. The narcissist meticulously studies how the empathetic individual forgives the transgressions of others, taking mental notes on how far those boundaries can eventually be pushed. They are not admiring your kind heart. They are calculating the exact return on investment your forgiveness will yield. This calculated observation forms the bedrock of the emotional dependency they require to sustain their false self. History provides a masterclass in this exact form of threshold manipulation through the life and methods of the infamous 18th century seducer, Giacomo Casanova. While popular culture remembers him merely as a prolific romantic, a clinical examination of his historical methods reveals a textbook narcissistic predator operating at the peak of the seduction phase. Casanova did not rely on physical force or overt coercion to conquer his targets. Instead, he utilized aggressive mirroring, an intense, unwavering gaze, and highly targeted flattery to hack into the psychological defenses of the women he pursued. Casanova was a psychological chameleon who adapted his entire persona to fit the exact void in his victim's life. When he approached a woman who valued intellect, he suddenly became a brilliant philosopher, debating literature and art with fiery passion. If he targeted a woman who felt neglected and unseen by a cold husband, he transformed into a hyperattentive romantic, noticing every detail of her dress and hanging on her every word. He did not present his true self. He presented a perfectly calibrated mirror reflecting the victim's deepest, most desperate desires back at them. This aggressive mirroring creates an intoxicating illusion of profound compatibility. This historical method of aggressive mirroring is a staple of the modern narcissist's love-bombing toolkit. When they mirror you, they adopt your hobbies, your musical tastes, your political views, and even your unique vocabulary. You are not falling in love with a separate human being. You are falling in love with a reflection of your own soul, carefully projected back at you by a predator. The intense, predatory gaze, often described by victims as feeling like they were the only person in the room, is designed to induce a trance-like state. It is a biological hack that triggers a massive release of dopamine and oxytocin, the neurochemicals responsible for bonding and trust. Alongside the mirroring and the gaze comes the targeted flattery. Unlike generic compliments, the narcissist's flattery is highly specific and laser-focused on the exact insecurities they identified during their intelligence-gathering phase. If you have always felt intellectually inadequate, they will praise your brilliant mind. If you have always felt physically undesirable, they will worship your body with a terrifying, religious fervor. They find the darkest, coldest rooms in your psychological house and flood them with blinding, artificial light. Through this meticulous combination of mirroring, intense focus, and weaponized flattery, the narcissist achieves their primary objective, forging a foundational emotional dependency. The victim begins to rely on the narcissist as their primary source of validation, joy, and emotional regulation. The outside world begins to fade away, replaced by the intoxicating, insular bubble of the manufactured soulmate dynamic. The victim willingly, even eagerly, steps aside and invites the predator across the threshold, believing they are welcoming the love of their life into their sanctuary. The tragedy of the threshold is that the invitation is given with a pure heart and open arms. The highly empathetic victim believes they have finally found a safe harbor, a partner who truly sees the depths of their spirit. They do not realize that the person standing in their living room is a carefully constructed hologram, a false self designed entirely to bypass the alarm systems. The emotional dependency has been successfully installed, and the victim is now hooked on the chemical rush of the idealization phase. They are conditioned to crave the narcissist's approval and presence above all else, blinding them to the subtle red flags that have already begun to wave. This is the insidious genius of the vampire's seduction. By tricking you into issuing the invitation, they absolve themselves of the break-in. When the dynamic eventually shifts, they will use this very invitation against you, reminding you that you chose them, that you wanted this, and that you opened the door. The foundation of the trauma bond is cemented in this golden period, ensuring that when the mask finally slips, the victim will not run. The threshold has been crossed, and the defenses are completely down. The intelligence has been gathered, and the emotional dependency is locked securely in place. The victim is now deeply, profoundly attached to a phantom who mirrors their every hope. Only now, securely inside the house, with the doors locked from the inside, and the victim entirely disarmed by the illusion of true love, does the narcissist prepare for the next phase. Once the threshold is crossed, and the doors are locked from the inside, the golden light of the idealization phase begins to flicker and dim. The temperature in the room subtly drops, and a creeping, disorienting atmosphere begins to seep through the floorboards. This is the onset of the devaluation phase, characterized by what we can call the mesmeric fog. It is a calculated psychological weather system designed to confuse, blind, and paralyze the prey so that escape becomes entirely impossible. The vampire does not immediately bare their fangs. Instead, they exhale a thick cloud of confusion that obscures the exit entirely. Within this fog, the predator utilizes the hypnotic gaze, a metaphor for the intense, destabilizing focus they use to entirely dominate the victim's perception of reality. You cannot fight an enemy you cannot see, and you cannot flee a maze when the walls are constantly shifting. The narcissist relies on this profound disorientation to slowly dismantle the very identity that they previously claimed to worship. What was once praised as a unique quirk is suddenly marked as a fatal character flaw. The victim's strengths are systematically inverted into weaknesses, leaving them stumbling blindly through the dark. To understand the sheer destructive power of this identity dismantling, we must examine one of the most tragic artistic relationships of the 20th century, the destructive bond between artist Pablo Picasso and photographer Dora Maar. In the 1930s, Maar was a brilliant surrealist photographer with a vibrant, fiercely independent intellect. She was a creative force of nature, a woman who commanded respect among the Parisian avant-garde and possessed a deeply grounded sense of self. When she met Picasso, their initial connection was framed as a passionate meeting of equal creative titans. However, once he had secured her devotion, the psychological demolition began. Picasso systematically set out to destroy Maar's autonomy, recognizing that her vibrant independence was a direct threat to his absolute control. He began by attacking the very core of her identity, her art. He relentlessly mocked her groundbreaking photography, insisting it was an inferior medium, and demanded she take up painting instead. By forcing her into his own domain, he ensured she would always remain his inferior, constantly seeking his validation in a space where he was the undisputed master. This was not mentorship. It was a calculated erasure of her unique, authentic voice. His cruelty was not limited to artistic sabotage. He actively isolated her from her intellectual peers and purposefully manufactured chaotic love triangles. He would invite his other mistresses into their shared spaces, forcing the women to fight for his attention while he watched with detached amusement. The brilliant, independent photographer was slowly reduced to a weeping, emotionally dependent subordinate who profoundly doubted her own worth. Picasso famously painted her exclusively as the weeping woman, immortalizing the very psychological agony he was actively inflicting upon her. The vibrant woman who entered the fog was entirely consumed, replaced by a shattered, gaslit shadow. This historical tragedy is a textbook execution of the clinical mechanics explored by psychoanalyst Dr. Robin Stern in her groundbreaking work, The Gaslight Effect. Dr. Stern outlines how abusers systematically erode a victim's confidence in their own memory, perception, and sanity. The mesmeric fog is not created overnight. It is built through 1,000 tiny, deniable infractions that slowly rewrite the victim's reality. A conversation is denied, a promise is retracted, or an event is completely fabricated, leaving the victim entirely off balance. The narcissist speaks with such unwavering, hypnotic conviction that the victim naturally begins to assume their own mind is failing them. Dr. Stern identifies 3 stages of this psychological destabilization: disbelief, defense, and finally, depression. Initially, the victim simply assumes there has been a misunderstanding, trying logically to explain their perspective to the vampire. As the fog thickens, the victim enters the defense stage, desperately arguing and searching for evidence to prove they are not crazy or forgetful. Eventually, exhausted by the relentless hypnotic gaze, the victim surrenders to the depression stage. They yield their reality to the abuser, accepting the narcissist as the sole, authoritative narrator of their life. The engine that drives this descent into madness is a behavioral concept known as intermittent reinforcement. If the narcissist were cruel 100% of the time, the victim's survival instincts would eventually override the fog, and they would flee. To prevent this, the vampire splices periods of sudden, inexplicable cruelty with tiny, intoxicating breadcrumbs of their former affection. A week of silent treatment and biting insults is suddenly broken by a grand, romantic gesture or a tearful apology. This creates a psychological slot machine, where the victim becomes addicted to pulling the lever, desperately hoping for the jackpot of the idealization phase to return. The clinical application of intermittent reinforcement alters the victim's brain chemistry, keeping them in a state of perpetual hyperarousal and anxiety. They are constantly walking on eggshells, monitoring the narcissist's moods, trying to predict which version of their partner will walk through the door. This unpredictability binds the victim tighter to the abuser than consistent kindness ever could. The trauma bond is forged in the fires of this inconsistency, as the victim begins to associate the relief from the abuser's cruelty with genuine love. They are starved in the dark, making a single drop of water feel like an absolute miracle. This erratic push-and-pull dynamic breeds profound cognitive dissonance within the victim's mind. Cognitive dissonance is the intense psychological distress experienced when a person holds two entirely contradictory beliefs at the exact same time. The victim is forced to reconcile the image of the perfect, loving soulmate who crossed their threshold with the cold, calculating stranger currently standing before them. The human brain cannot tolerate this level of internal conflict, and it desperately seeks a way to resolve the agonizing paradox. Tragically, the easiest way to resolve it is for the victim to blame themselves. The victim rationalizes that if they are the cause of the vampire's cruelty, then they hold the power to fix it. They convince themselves that if they can just be more patient, more understanding, or more perfect, the fog will lift and the golden period will return. The narcissist actively encourages this self-blame, projecting all of their own toxic behaviors onto the target. Every argument, every betrayal, and every cruel remark is twisted to be the victim's fault. The hypnotic gaze demands total compliance, insisting that the victim is fundamentally broken and incredibly lucky to be tolerated at all. Capitalizing on the victim's exhausted, confused state, the narcissist frequently deploys the tactic of reactive abuse. This is a highly calculated maneuver where the abuser relentlessly pokes, prods, and provokes the victim behind closed doors until the victim finally snaps. After days or weeks of subtle psychological torture, the victim might yell, throw an object, or lash out in sheer, desperate panic. Instantly, the vampire drops the aggression and adopts a calm, patronizing demeanor. They point to the victim's emotional explosion as undeniable proof that the victim is the unstable, abusive one in the relationship. Reactive abuse is a masterstroke of the mesmeric fog, as it provides the narcissist with the exact ammunition they need to completely validate the gaslighting. The victim, horrified by their own loss of control, feels immense guilt and shame, further cementing their belief that they are the problem. They apologize profusely, begging for forgiveness from the very predator who orchestrated the entire breakdown. The narcissist graciously accepts the apology, tightening their grip on the victim's reality and reinforcing their position of moral superiority. The victim's own natural defense mechanisms have been weaponized entirely against them. To ensure the victim cannot find their way out of this psychological labyrinth, the vampire must systematically sever all external lifelines. The fog is only effective if there is no outside breeze to blow it away. The narcissist begins a covert campaign to isolate the victim from their friends, family, and support networks. They might claim that these outsiders are jealous, toxic, or simply do not understand the special bond that the two of them share. Slowly, the victim is convinced to distance themselves from anyone who might provide an objective, healthy reality check. If isolation by persuasion fails, the narcissist will manufacture chaos to force the separation. They will pick fights right before social events, ensuring the victim arrives exhausted and anxious, or they will behave so poorly around the victim's friends that those friends simply stop calling. By cutting these tethers to the outside world, the narcissist guarantees that the victim has nowhere else to turn for validation or perspective. The victim's world shrinks down to the size of a single room, occupied only by themselves and the vampire. The isolation becomes total, and the disorientation is absolute. Without a mirror to reflect their true self, the victim's vibrant identity is completely overwritten by the narcissist's dark projections. They no longer trust their own memories, their own judgments, or their own intrinsic worth. The mesmeric fog has done its job, reducing an autonomous, thriving individual into a hollowed-out, deeply dependent subordinate. They are trapped in the center of the labyrinth, paralyzed by the hypnotic gaze, desperately waiting for the predator to offer them a breadcrumb of affection. The devaluation phase has successfully dismantled the prey, leaving them entirely defenseless and primed for the horrors to come. The ultimate tragedy of this phase is that the victim actively participates in their own erasure, believing they are making necessary sacrifices for love. They silence their own laughter, abandon their lifelong passions, and shrink their personality to avoid triggering the narcissist's sudden rage. They become a ghost, haunting their own life, walking softly through the fog so as not to disturb the predator that holds them captive. The vibrant colors of their former existence are bleached away, replaced by the grayscale reality dictated entirely by the abuser. The vampire does not just break the heart, they systematically dismantle the mind. The doors remain locked, but the illusion of a shared sanctuary has been completely shattered. The victim is no longer a partner, but a captive audience to a grand, terrifying psychological performance. The hypnotic gaze holds them firmly in place, ensuring they cannot look away from the very source of their destruction. The groundwork of confusion, dependency, and isolation has been flawlessly laid. The fog is now impenetrable, and the victim is entirely subdued, waiting in the dark for the vampire's ultimate, devastating purpose to be revealed. That devastating purpose is the chronic extraction phase, a period defined by the chilling mechanics of siphoning the blood. The elaborate illusions, the disorienting labyrinths, and the systematic isolation were never the end goals of this psychological siege. They were merely the surgical preparations required to secure the host before the true feeding could commence. In the realm of pathological abuse, the vampire does not bite the neck. They latch onto the psyche. They begin a methodical, relentless draining of the victim's most precious internal and external assets. In this clinical framework, blood represents the victim's literal life force. It is their emotional bandwidth, their financial stability, their professional reputation, and their sheer physiological vitality. The predator fundamentally lacks the internal mechanisms to generate these life-sustaining resources independently. They are entirely reliant on a living, breathing host to provide the continuous energetic fuel required to keep their own psychological engine running. To comprehend the absolute necessity of this extraction, we must turn to the foundational psychoanalytic theories of Heinz Kohut. Kohut introduced the clinical concept of narcissistic supply, fundamentally changing how modern psychology understands the predator's underlying motivation. According to his framework, individuals with severe narcissistic deficits do not possess a fully formed, independent identity. Instead, they require a constant stream of external validation, attention, and emotional reactions from others to construct and maintain a cohesive sense of self. This concept is further hardened by the writings of psychoanalyst Otto Kernberg, who explored the darker, more destructive facets of pathological narcissism. Kernberg detailed how the narcissist harbors a profoundly hollow, barren core, entirely incapable of regulating its own self-esteem. To stave off the agonizing reality of their own internal emptiness and prevent psychological annihilation, they must constantly parasitize those around them. They do not view their partners as autonomous human beings, but rather as functional appliances, what psychoanalysis terms self-objects, whose sole purpose is to regulate the predator's internal void. History offers a chilling, perfect archetype of this malignant exploitation in the form of the 16th century Hungarian noblewoman, Countess Elizabeth Báthory. Popular folklore remembers her as a literal monster who bathed in the blood of virgins to preserve her own youth, But clinical analysis requires us to strip away the Gothic myth. Beneath the supernatural legends lies the ultimate historical blueprint of the grandiose narcissist. Báthory was a figure of immense, unchecked privilege who violently consumed the vitality of her subordinates to sustain her own hollow, false self. The Countess could not tolerate the natural progression of time, nor could she bear the deep, agonizing inadequacy that festered beneath her aristocratic facade. To artificially inflate her grandiosity, she systematically targeted young, vibrant servants, individuals who possessed the very life force she felt slipping away. Her cruelty was not simply random sadism. It was a desperately calculated extraction process designed to ward off her own internal collapse. By destroying the youth and autonomy of those beneath her, she manufactured a terrifying illusion of omnipotence, absorbing their destroyed vitality to mask her own decay. The modern narcissist operates with the exact same parasitic entitlement, albeit without the medieval dungeons. They seek out hosts who are brimming with the very qualities they lack: joy, empathy, resilience, and ambition. Once the host is secured, the vampire begins to siphon these traits, methodically transferring the victim's light into their own endless abyss. As the extraction accelerates, a horrifying, visible exchange begins to take place in the dynamic. The predator seemingly grows stronger, more confident, and more successful, directly fueled by the energetic theft. Conversely, the victim begins to wither, paying a devastating, measurable somatic toll for the ongoing exploitation. The human body cannot distinguish between physical danger and chronic psychological predation, and it responds to the siphoning with a cascade of physiological alarms. This is the brutal onset of complex post-traumatic stress disorder, or C-PTSD. The victim's central nervous system becomes permanently locked in a state of high alert, flooding their bloodstream with toxic, prolonged levels of cortisol and adrenaline. This relentless hormonal flooding ravages the physical body, manifesting as severe, unexplainable physiological symptoms. Victims experience chronic fatigue that no amount of sleep can cure, agonizing muscle tremors, migraines, and a severely compromised immune system. Their cognitive function declines drastically, resulting in a pervasive brain fog that makes simple daily tasks feel utterly insurmountable. The body is literally keeping score, visibly breaking down as its essential energetic reserves are continuously pumped into the narcissist's bottomless void. The siphoning extends far beyond physical and emotional energy, reaching deep into the victim's tangible, worldly resources. The vampire views the host's bank accounts, credit scores, and professional networks as an extension of their rightful supply. They will financially parasitize the victim, racking up massive debts, sabotaging career opportunities, and draining savings accounts with absolute, chilling entitlement. The host is bled dry on every conceivable front, their entire existence repurposed to fund and fuel the narcissist's grand illusion. Every tear shed, every dollar spent, and every sleepless night endured by the victim serves as a direct deposit into the predator's psychological bank account. The narcissist feels a profound sense of superiority watching their host deteriorate, interpreting the victim's collapse as undeniable proof of their own power. They consume the host's sanity and stability, using the extracted resources to present a flawless, thriving public image to the outside world. Behind closed doors, however, the reality is a gruesome scene of relentless emotional vampirism. Eventually, this systematic extraction reaches its inevitable mathematical conclusion. The victim, once a vibrant and thriving individual, is reduced to an empty, trembling husk. Their emotional bandwidth is entirely depleted, their financial resources are in ruins, and their physical health has collapsed under the weight of chronic stress. They have nothing left to give, no more light to steal, and no more energy to fuel the predator's endless demands. The reservoir has run completely dry. It is at this precise moment of total depletion that the vampire initiates the final, most devastating maneuver of the abuse cycle, the discard phase. A parasite has absolutely no use for a drained host, and the narcissist feels no loyalty, gratitude, or empathy for the vessel they have just destroyed. The moment the victim can no longer provide high-quality narcissistic supply, they lose all value in the eyes of the abuser. The transition from vital self-object to worthless refuse happens in the blink of an eye. The discard is sudden, brutal, and executed with a terrifying surgical coldness. There is no closure, no remorse, and no acknowledgement of the profound damage that has been inflicted over the course of the relationship. The narcissist simply drops the empty vessel and walks away, their gaze already scanning the horizon for a fresh, untapped source of supply. To the predator, the ending of the relationship is as emotionally significant as throwing away a depleted battery. The victim is left entirely devastated, abandoned in the wreckage of their own life, and struggling to survive the intense somatic fallout. They struggle to comprehend how a person who once claimed to cherish them can now step over their collapsed body without a single backward glance. The illusion of the false self is fully revealed in this absolute, chilling apathy. The vampire has successfully fed, leaving behind a shattered shell as they seamlessly move on to their next victim, entirely untouched by the destruction they leave in their wake. Yet this absolute devastation is not the end of the story. It is the agonizing but necessary clearing for the final phase of the cycle. To survive the discard and ensure the predator can never return, the victim must master the mechanics of absolute severance and recovery. In the lore of the undead, survival requires two definitive weapons: sunlight and the wooden stake. These are not mere defensive tactics, but aggressive, structural boundaries designed to bring about the permanent death of the toxic bond. The vampire thrives in the shadows of secrecy and ambiguity, making radical exposure and impenetrable limits the only cure. Sunlight represents the radical, unflinching exposure of the abuser's true nature, both to the victim themselves and to the outside world. It is the agonizing process of stepping out of the mesmeric fog and forcing the eyes to adjust to the blinding reality of the exploitation. The victim must stop romanticizing the golden period and recognize it for the calculated infiltration it always was. By illuminating the mechanics of the abuse, the victim strips the narcissist of their mystique, reducing an omnipotent monster to a predictable, pathetic parasite. This cognitive shift is the dawn breaking over the ruins of the relationship. The wooden stake, then, is the implementation of impenetrable boundaries that strike directly at the heart of the trauma bond. It is the conscious, terrifying decision to sever all energetic, financial, and emotional ties, accepting massive short-term losses for the guarantee of long-term survival. The stake is not driven into the abuser, but into the connection itself, permanently killing the dynamic that allowed the siphoning to occur. This requires a radical acceptance that justice or closure will never be granted by the predator. True liberation demands walking away from the negotiation table entirely. Modern history provides a masterful, documented blueprint of this exact, literal severance through the harrowing escape of music icon Tina Turner. For years, she was trapped in a profoundly violent, parasitic dynamic with her husband and musical partner, Ike Turner. Ike controlled every aspect of her existence, from her finances and career to her physical safety, operating as the ultimate grandiose extractor. He relied entirely on her sheer, undeniable talent to fuel his own fragile ego and public persona, violently suppressing any attempt she made to assert her autonomy. Her survival required a decisive, absolute strike against the very foundation of their bond. On a humid midnight in 1976, after suffering a brutal physical assault en route to a hotel, Tina Turner finally drove the stake into the heart of her trauma bond. While Ike slept, she fled into the dark with nothing but a bloody suit, 36 cents in her pocket, and a gas station credit card. She sprinted across a busy highway, risking her physical life to save her psychological soul. By leaving the hotel, she wasn't just escaping a beating. She was actively starving the parasite of its primary host. This midnight flight remains one of the most powerful real-world examples of radical, immediate severance. During the subsequent divorce proceedings, Tina executed the ultimate defensive maneuver by refusing to fight for the millions of dollars they had earned together. She willingly left behind the cars, the real estate, and the recording studios, recognizing that these assets were heavily laced with the predator's toxic energy. The only thing she demanded to keep was her autonomous identity, her stage name, Tina Turner. By abandoning the material wealth, she completely disarmed Ike's ability to drag her into endless, draining legal battles. She purchased her absolute freedom with the very resources he had stolen from her. To understand the clinical mechanics of this type of detachment, victims must adopt the protocols established by clinical psychologist Dr. Ramani de Vasula. Dr. Ramani advocates for the strict application of the grey rock method when absolute physical escape is temporarily impossible or when co-parenting requires minimal interaction. To grey rock, a narcissist is to become as uninteresting, unresponsive, and emotionally flat as a pebble on the ground. When the vampire attempts to provoke a reaction, whether through insults or sudden, manufactured crises, the victim responds with dull, monotonous, non-committal answers. The objective of grey rock is to deliberately starve the predator of the emotional reactivity they require for narcissistic supply. Vampires feed on high-frequency emotions. They delight in your tears, your screaming anger, and your desperate pleas for understanding. By flattening your affect and refusing to engage in their chaotic theater, you make yourself completely unpalatable to their tastes. The narcissist quickly realizes that striking you yields no energetic return, like trying to draw blood from a stone. Eventually, bored and starved, they are forced to seek their supply elsewhere. In situations where complete emotional flatness might trigger dangerous escalations in the workplace or legal settings, Dr. Ramani introduces the yellow rock method. Yellow rocking employs the same core principle of emotional detachment, but wraps it in a superficial layer of polite, professional cordiality. You say please, thank you, and good morning, but you offer absolutely zero personal information or authentic emotional depth. It is a corporate, diplomatic firewall that prevents the narcissist from accusing you of being hostile while simultaneously blocking their access to your psychological interior. Both methods are vital tools for maintaining the boundary of the wooden stake. With the immediate bleeding stopped and the boundaries established, the grueling work of psychological resurrection must begin. For this, the clinical roadmap is provided by Dr. Judith Herman in her seminal text, Trauma and Recovery. Dr. Herman outlines that healing from complex, interpersonal trauma cannot happen in isolation. It requires a deliberate, structured rebuilding of the victim's shattered psychological immune system. The first stage of this recovery is the establishment of absolute safety, which means securing the physical environment and stabilizing the nervous system. The victim must teach their body that the chronic extraction phase is definitively over. Once safety is secured, Dr. Herman dictates that the survivor must enter the phase of remembrance and mourning. This is the painful process of grieving not just the relationship, but the illusion of the soulmate that crossed the threshold during the love-bombing phase. The victim must mourn the time, energy, and resources that were stolen, accepting the profound unfairness of the exploitation. By speaking the truth of the abuse aloud, often within the safety of a therapeutic relationship, the survivor strips away the lingering remnants of the mesmeric fog. The narrative of their life is slowly wrestled back from the narcissist's control. The final stage of Dr. Herman's framework is reconnection, where the survivor actively rebuilds a new identity and reestablishes healthy ties with the outside world. The isolation imposed by the vampire is systematically dismantled as the survivor learns to trust their own intuition again. They rediscover the passions, hobbies, and friendships that were erased during the devaluation phase. This rebuilt psychological immune system is fundamentally stronger, fortified by the agonizing lessons of the past. The survivor is no longer the naive, blindly empathetic target who opened the door. They are a seasoned defender of their own threshold. However, the survivor must remain eternally vigilant, for a narcissist rarely views a discard or an escape as permanent. Months or even years later, when their new sources of supply inevitably fail, the vampire will attempt a maneuver known as hoovering. They will reach out with a casual text, a tearful apology, or a manufactured emergency, testing the perimeter to see if the wooden stake has rotted. They are betting that the survivor's empathy has overridden their memory of the abuse. This is the critical moment where the final, absolute defense must be deployed. The definitive, structural tool required to permanently banish the vampire is the enforcement of strict, uncompromising, no contact. No contact is the ultimate garlic against the narcissist's hoovering attempts. It is not a temporary silent treatment designed to punish the abuser, nor is it a negotiation tactic to make them miss you. It is a permanent, lifelong blockade. It means blocking phone numbers, filtering emails, deleting social media connections, and refusing to entertain messages passed through mutual acquaintances. By enforcing no contact, the survivor definitively closes the casket on the dynamic, ensuring the predator can never again cross their threshold. The trauma bond is finally starved of the oxygen it needs to reignite, and the nervous system is allowed to permanently settle into a state of peace. The psychological vampires of this world rely entirely on our willingness to keep the door cracked open just a fraction of an inch. When we slam it shut, lock it, and walk away without looking back, their power over us completely evaporates. Escaping the narcissist is the hardest battle you will ever fight, but it is the only path to reclaiming your sovereign soul. You must choose to step out of their manufactured shadows and back into the warmth of the daylight. The scars of the extraction will remain, but they will serve as lifelong reminders of your incredible, unbreakable resilience. Thank you so much for watching this video and taking the time to understand the dark reality of narcissistic abuse. Please subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into psychology, survival, and the mechanics of the human mind.